Well, thank you very much for choosing to watch this presentation. Today, it's a discussion of the BCO briefing note, which is thoughts on office specification and design after COVID-19. We're here for about 30 minutes today, and in that time we can only hope to touch on some of the issues raised by the paper. So without any time to waste then, I'll push on with some introductions. My name is Suzanne Gill and I'm a commercial property partner at Wedlake Bell. I'm co-founder of our Tomorrow's Cities Today's Challenge campaign, and I'm joined today by my fellow co-founder, Helen Garthwaite, who's a partner in our construction law team, and like my other three guests today, has contributed to the BCO guide for office specification and office fit out. Also today with us, we have Neil Pennell, who is Head of Design, Innovation and Property Solutions at Landsec, and Peter Williams, who's the Technical Advisor to Stanhope. So looking at the guide then, which you'll be able to find on the website, in the short term, Peter, what's it going to be like for workers when they go back to offices?
Well, there's quite a bit of detail in the document giving our thoughts on the more detailed aspects. But I think for most of the workers, it's going to be an issue of building trust. They're going to be understandably nervous about the return to the work. And perhaps the biggest hurdle they'll have to overcome is that of commuting by public transport. But I think to ease them into a return to work and deal with some of this trust issue, it's going to be important for employers to give them lots of guidance in advance about what they can expect once they get to the workplace. And arriving at their office is the things that are going to be heavily on their mind, I think, are going to revolve around social distancing and hygiene. And social distancing is going to come in two parts, that which is provided by the building itself and that's which is provided by the employer's workplace. I think running through the building role of building management is going to be important to usher people through reception into lift lobbies, and particularly through the thorny issue of how many people get in a lift or how many people go upstairs at a time. On hygiene front, I think there's a big message here about prominent display and provision of things like hand sanitizers and notices advising them to wash their hands. They might not need to be told that, but it'd be good there by way of reminder. And about the workplace in general, I think cleaning is going to be ever more evident, and that's we're seeing routine cleaning staff turning up and having notices and helplines and so on and call to help them have that level of hygiene that will give them some kind of confidence in the return.
Thanks. So Neil, then, looking at those, can you envisage any further adaptations needed to reinforce that hygiene and social distancing method and message in the short term?
Well, I think the social distancing piece is certainly going to be what informs the short term and any other guidance that we get from government. In the paper, we touched on a number of elements, as Peter has said, but there's also, I guess, from a commercial building perspective, there's about the responsibilities and who should be doing what in the process. So there are buildings, obviously, that are occupiers or let on full repairing and insuring leases where the whole process will be under the control of one organisation. But obviously there are multi-occupied offices where there are areas of common parts and shared areas that need to be adapted and managed so that we can deal with the virus in the short, medium term. I think probably one key factor that is going to be at the forefront of people's mind is the occupancy levels that you can cope with in those two aspects. One, the journey through the building, and secondly, the occupation of the space. And certainly for multi-occupied buildings, owners and occupiers are going to have to work really closely together and collaborate. Needs to be a consistent approach across the building, knowledge sharing between them. And I think that's a, if there is a silver lining to this cloud, I think we've really seen a feature of the crisis has been the willingness of people to share ideas and knowledge, to work together and to collaborate. So if you start at the point of people entering the office, there's a whole issue about how you get there in the first place and public and private transport, which we might touch on at some point. But obviously once you're in the space where we're focusing, then it's about minimising the number of touch points wherever you can. If that opportunity exists, you may temporarily suspend your speed gates, signage that could be directing people what to do, but also clear signage on the floor. You've seen the sort of things that the world of retail has adapted to in recent times, with spacing for people to queue. as you enter confined areas of space, particularly perhaps in lift lobbies, then there needs to be some management protocols and a lot of education of the people coming into the building, how to use those spaces, how many people can get into a lift, how's that process going to be controlled using staircases, getting to the floor itself, and then obviously the occupation of that floor, looking at the spread of the desks and where people sit. That needs to be organised. There'll be quite a lot of work, I think, for space planners to analyse those things and help people to lay out the spaces. It's bound to have some impact on the sort of population density in the building that the building can cope with at these times. But I think with some good planning, we can get through that process and get some good safe working spaces for people to use in the building.
Thanks, Neil. So some of those adaptations relatively straightforward, but you touched just on the end on the point I wanted to pick up with Helen, and that's the legal implications for occupiers for delivering some of these changes with their staff.
Occupiers face the immediate challenge, of course, as Peter said, to reassure a workforce which in fact is now highly cognizant of health and hygiene factors, and they need to be regaining their trust in that the office is a safe and healthy place to return to work in. And all those adaptations and the protocols that both Neil and Peter mentioned are all very encouraging factors. But in doing so, HR teams and indeed occupiers are going to be thinking very hard and needing to take care in planning and in particular in communication, and mostly mindfulness of employment responsibilities will be essential in this context. There's likely to be a need for collaboration, as has been said, between not only landlord and tenant, but internally between HR and FM personnel and indeed managing agents where you have multi-let buildings. So absolutely critical to implementing the practical solutions is understanding the context of each individual occupier and to some degree the employees and their arrangements. So for example, there's been an announcement, I think only in the last 24 hours, that UK government have indicated that they're to publish advice on reopening of buildings with a focus particularly looking at this in granular detail with the Health and Safety Executive. And so the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy is looking to approve apparently standards for employers, and that's going to impact here. If so, I think also there's been quite a lot of press about other players in the market, such as CIPD launching their own practical guides to help people think about the planning and return to work. And some of the items that have been indicated as being focused on here are things like safe working. How can it take place in confined areas, like for example, offices, while keeping in mind the social distancing measures as we've heard talked about. Advice also to restrict access, interestingly, to communal workplace spaces. And I'd be interested to know there whether that extends to building lobbies and lifts, but also to perhaps within office space, communal areas such as office canteens, areas for coffee and breakout space, which has been quite fashionable to bring into offices, particularly those recently, where in fact the serendipitous encounter at the coffee point is to be encouraged, and the collaborative ways of working in open plan have looked at those areas and the proximity of people. So it's encouraging to hear the practical measures, but if that's the guidance that is likely to be is to influence from government the granular detail return to work, it'll be interesting for us to spotlight on that and see how those requirements, which are necessarily going to influence guidance and therefore probably employment legislation, are going to interplay with these practical aspects. For example, I mean, we were talking about perhaps the journey to work and staggered work times, but can that be facilitated through employment contracts? Does the tenant occupier have the ability to dictate when its staff enters and leaves a building, starts and stops work? How about situations such as the Equality Act, where we are aware that reasonable adjustments have to be made for people with a disability, but will staff with a vulnerability post-COVID also have to be taken into account in this context. I think there are some unanswered questions, but one can see a prediction that these are things that are likely to need not only consideration within occupiers, but then resound in these measures that Neil and Peter have talked about in terms of implementation with managing agents and landlords.
So even in the short term, we've got quite a lot to work through, but I'm sure that can be done. Neil, looking forward ahead, is one thing to adapt an existing building. When you've got a blank sheet of paper for a new building, for a new design, what would you do things differently in a post-COVID world if you started from scratch?
It depends what that post-COVID world is, I guess. It's a very open question, very good question. And obviously in the paper, we started to sort of put some pointers to get people thinking about it, because I think it is important that we think about it. There are obviously mega trends that impact all the time on office design, workplace practices, the way people work, the technology they use. All these things have affected building design over periods of time. But I think health and safety, wellness in buildings has always been a factor in building design. I think the COVID-19 will be a big, strong reminder that we need to think about that again going forward, and what can we do in design terms, maybe to make buildings more resilient, more flexible in these times. If we get to a point where the long heralded vaccine cures us all and we're all okay, or we eradicate the virus in some other form, then maybe everybody will, have a tendency to revert back to something like the normal they knew before. But certainly looking at the social distancing piece, which is obviously a key mechanism in controlling the virus, looking at the spatial allowances for common parts areas, from approaches to lifts and communication routes through the building, is obviously going to give architects something to think about going forward. For the engineers, there's a lot in terms of knowledge about the virus transmission routes and the importance that really good ventilation can play in minimising the risks in a given space. Interestingly, some research has pointed not only to ventilation of the air, but also its humidity level can also either remit or encourage transmission of the virus. So there is a sort of zone of humidity that is optimal in terms of minimising virus transmission. Certainly low humidities are a particular problem. So that might influence some of the engineering in buildings to provide methods and strategies to look at humidity control. So it's interesting, some of the things may be thought about, may never be actioned, because as the problems of the virus recede and other factors come into play, and commercial challenges that we'll all face, it will be interesting to see how people take that forward into their designs. But everybody looks to differentiate their buildings going forward. There's been a growing focus on health and well-being. We've seen the rise of a number of rating standards that are used to focus on those things, and I'm sure that there will be categories that are introduced post-COVID that will also encourage certain design thinking. So I think it's important that we look at all aspects, but certainly the spatial use in buildings, how you use space, how you fit out that space, interior designers, I think they will have a lot of new thinking to do in the way that they design spaces, and maybe that there's a sort of outbreak period where you put in one regime, and when an outbreak is dealt with, you retract back to another more relaxed position. So that flexibility and ability to adapt the space will be important, and things that you can put into the design of buildings that will enable that to happen, I think will be good. From a sort of control of the building perspective, being able to remotely do some actions, I think would have been a real help in the shutdown process we've all experienced. So we will be all in a place of greater knowledge as we move forward. But I think now's probably a relatively short opportunity in terms of time for us to think about those first short-term adaptations. And then once we've got through that, we need to think again about buildings that we're currently designing and developing, and what do we do in the future. And obviously in all typologies of buildings, but our focus for the BCO is on the workplace. But as Peter, I think, will mention later, we have to think about even within the sort of office world, there is a number of mixed-use buildings, so you have to deal with other aspects of the built environment and the placemaking around it, and its interconnectivity with the transportation that brings people to and from the buildings.
Thanks very much. Of course, my question presupposes that people will want to go back to offices. Helen, what do you think will drag everyone away from working at home into the office?
Well, I think that's a key focus, in fact, because people have got used to working at home. You know, some have perhaps had experiences of working from home with the tensions of other occupants in their household of finding it perhaps more challenging than ideally they thought it was, whereas others have, I think, adjusted to it extremely well. There are even people who talk about going back to life as normal and back to the office, and we must remember that many of our younger people who will have started in their jobs may well be joining organisations and have never actually yet been in an office. And so the pull of that office, that drawback to the office, is going to be, I think, particularly for social reasons, but in a new factored health and hygiene world, as Neil has said. You know, I don't think we'll immediately go back to holding, you know, receptions and presentations in the office with large numbers of people, and I think the need for a reuse and rethinking of space is absolutely right, not just in terms of density, but in terms of the nature of that space. I mentioned earlier, you know, risks of close proximity in office canteens and so on, and it may well be that people are going to look for more green space in buildings, both within buildings and on the public realm around buildings, so that they can sit in the park and have their sandwich or do their meditation piece, because that's what they may have been doing at home, for those of them who've had the luxury of being perhaps in a more rural location or with gardens. Once we get back to the office, perhaps we might see an increased use of terracing with green space or internal garden space for lunchbox sessions and socialising in a more distant way, bearing in mind our social distancing rules. And I think that will change people's attitudes generally from some of the values. There was already a great deal of move towards wellness and mental and physical wellness and hygiene factors, and I think this is picking up more, and I think environmental factors too shouldn't be ignored, and those benchmarks that deal with well and environmental criteria again are likely to come to the fore. I think some of the tensions between those will need to be ironed out, but certainly there's going to be a need to fulfill that in a workforce. Age demographic will play a part there too, and I think the perceived vulnerability of people will also be an important factor. Perhaps one of the other things to think about is that the office rurally or in a non-dense city location might become more attractive. So the out of town hub office, with perhaps more space around it and more space to factor this in, may have a different pull and different shape to the internal city office, which may have different design solutions, and that may also perhaps impact on values. So an interesting play there for asset management and values, investment values for the future, I think.
So you started off by talking about taking the best of home working into the office to make sure that people do come to the office, and we improve the office by making it more like home in a way. Peter, do you think that's an accurate summary, or is there more to add to bring people back to the office?
I think there's more to it. I'd like to reply really to both Neil and Helen's comments. I think I take on board Neil's comments about what we might do in terms of varying the product, changing the product office in the future. But I think we need to face the brutal reality that we're going to be pretty cash strapped over the next few years. And so in terms of anything that we do with the office, it's got to be financially acceptable as well. On that basis, I think there's probably a lot we can do by way of process rather than varying the product. And good disaster recovery planning can allow us to reinstate pre-vaccine times quite quickly by reducing the occupancy of the office and moving more people to home working. So I think there's some flexibility in the way that we use our office space rather than necessarily trying to change the office space too much. But having said that, and picking up on Helen's point, I think why would people want to go into an office? They'll have enjoyed working at home, as we talked about. So what is it that would pull them? I suppose the most simple aspects might be facilities or technologies that they don't have at home, but increasingly I guess that's less likely. I think it's much more to do with the social connections of the community that they have with their friends and colleagues. And for particularly those people at the early stages of their career, how do they learn from people? You know, the office is a great learning environment for young people, whereas perhaps sitting at home behind a laptop screen doesn't really expose them to the sort of experience that they want to gather. And with that, if they're trying to build a career, not only have they got to collect that learning, but bluntly, whether we like it or not, they've got to demonstrate to their peers and management above them that they're worthy of continued development and promotion. So I think more than anything, it would be those sort of aspects, the social and career-driven motivations that will pull people back to the office.
One thing to pick up on there is also the potential co-working type office spaces, which will need another focus. And I have in mind here some of the work that the BCO has previously done in publications around wearable tech and technology. And I think personal tech and personal equipment and storage for it might become another factor that going into the office may develop as a specialized area for that. People won't necessarily want to share computers and share desks in the way they might have thought about before, and certainly not if they haven't been confident about cleaning regimes. And that's as much a challenge for occupiers, but also it does mean that landlords need to think about facilitating that capability for perhaps wearable tech and enhanced tech. As Peter was saying, people may want to go to their office because they can get better technology there than they can at home. We've all got used to Zooming and Teamsing and everything else, and actually the office now, when we go back, people may still want you to have conference calls with Zoom. They may not want you to have the large scale meetings of the past, but if they do, they might want to have people joining virtually, and some people may well be working at home and therefore have to be connected in. So I can see an enhanced requirement for Wi-Fi and for technological equipment, perhaps virtual or 3D printing facilities, things that you may not get at home. The office will now need to provide, or certainly the office of the future will need to provide.
Well, I'd like to come back slightly later in the discussion to look at tech in more detail. But before we get there, I do need to challenge you all on the thorny issue of who's going to pay for these adaptations. Some of the ones that we've talked about are relatively low cost, making sure that there is always soap in the toilets. Some are potentially much, much more expensive. So who does the work and then who pays for it? Helen, do you want to lead on that, please?
I think you're quite right to pick that up, Suzanne, and I think this is somewhere where, sadly, people will be looking more closely, particularly in current arrangements on return to work at existing leases. If they haven't done so already, they will be spotlighting on how those changes can be made, but also how costs can be shared. Some of the immediate concerns on recovery of cost of adaptations and perhaps enhanced services such as cleaning, commonly those types of things in buildings are obviously managed through the service charge provisions, and those have always traditionally been negotiated, so I don't see anything new there. It will go back, as both Neil and Peter have said, to communication, landlord-tenant discussions, and indeed with multi-let buildings, you can expect some discussion around that. For example, commercial factors might influence in terms of the management factors for the building, such that an occupier can't have its own cleaning company. It may be that a multi-let building may require buy-in to a standard set of cleaning that the landlord will do, or building maintenance that the landlord will do, for example, for the future, beyond the parameters of what has been previously considered. And there will need to be negotiation there. But specific wording in existing leases is likely to be looked at, and certainly some tenants, for example, may have agreed a maximum maximum cap on those costs, and so that will provide some interesting debate, I'm sure. Other things may be looked at in terms of facilitation, not just cost, and I have in mind things like, you know, no smoking within buildings and so on. Landlords usually have provisions under agreements for lease to make rules concerning the building and how they're managed, and that may be utilised in a proactive way here to facilitate some of these adaptations, and perhaps also to do so in a way that is economically viable for all those occupiers within the building. And so there may be some double thinking there around rules and service charge arrangements. For new lease discussions, I think that's going to be an interesting one, because in addition to those items I've mentioned, and bearing in mind that we may not be out of the woods and there may be a risk of further lockdowns and indeed further pandemics as we move into these environmental and pandemic type challenges in the years ahead, this is an area I think we can see as coming up on the agenda for commercial negotiation. There's been so much in the press about discussion around rent, and indeed there has been some government intervention in terms of claims around that, which has been hotly debated. But I think reality is that the industry is going to look, the real estate industry is going to be looking more closely at these items in new lease discussions, and perhaps looking at cessor of rent adjustments or arrangements in terms of a negotiated structure. Suzanne, you may well have your own thoughts on that, because I know it's something that you've had some experience of, but that certainly would be my thoughts, is that these things will require, unfortunately, some detailed consideration of legal agreements.
Yes, I think for existing leases, all the service charges are negotiated bespoke to each building, certainly, and you need to read the fine print. You mentioned landlord regulations, which I think is a great point. Peter, can I pick up with you on regulations in mixed use buildings, which must be even more challenging?
Well, I guess it's not so much about regulation, it's simply about the complication of dealing with different tenant groups. In a commercial office, it's pretty straightforward. I'm not going to pretend the lease is straightforward, but from an occupier's point of view, there's a relatively homogeneous workforce who have reasonably predictable hours of operation and who are all working under some kind of condition of employment to their employees. So that there are quite a few rules which are explicit as well as implicit there. As soon as you wander into the realms of residential, particularly as part of a mixed-use scheme, then there aren't those constraints on the residential occupiers of the building, and you know there's a pretty broad it's a pretty broad church of people, and they can clearly they're in occupancy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They can have deliveries as and when they want them. They can have visitors at all hours of the day and night, and there are some constraints clearly in covenants and things there, but the fact remains they're much more difficult people to deal with. It's every occupier, every apartment has a relationship to deal with, rather than maybe 100,000 square feet of commercial tenant. And so I think the demands on the estate management team are probably already quite extreme, and under conditions of lockdown, you know, there's a danger of being called into the role of policeman as well, which they are ill-equipped to do, nor do they have the kind of authority to carry on. So I think mixed use has got a whole additional level of complexity above a pure commercial scheme.
Thank you. I think you're really right to highlight the role of the FM team, and this picks up on the point about technology that I promised we'd come back to, because one of the other ways in a classic office block that the FM team are going to upskill, I think, is when we introduce Proptech. And Neil, you had some really good comments to make about that.
I think obviously technology is playing an ever increasing role in our lives. Helen mentioned earlier the wearable technologies. We've already heard about the NHS application that will be potentially used to assist in the tracing and tracking of individuals that with the COVID infection as part of the method of controlling virus outbreaks going forward once we've got over the curve and got the thing under control. And we're in this intermediate phase between the virus still being out there, but in a controlled level, to a point in time when hopefully we'll have effective treatments and and a vaccine, that we can actually move forward and start to release some of the social distancing measures that we're all sort of becoming used to living with. So I think technology will play its part in all of that, and I think as you come into buildings and you lead buildings, technologies will play their part in that role. The visitor experience in buildings, how you deal with security, big focus, I think it was talked about recently on some of the government briefings about the growing sort of research into using cameras and temperature sensing of people in airports. Well, similar technologies are used in Asia now in their entrance areas where they've had SARS and MERS to cope with in the past, and perhaps become more sensitized to these things. So some of those technologies may be put to use in the UK as well, and in the British office marketplace. Peter thought there was also the potential of an app sort of poking you in the arm saying, have you washed your hands recently? And sort of we then started to talk about GDPR, which I know is a subject that Helen is the expert on this panel. Sort of how much are people going to feel comfortable with technology being part of the process, particularly when it becomes in some form informing people about the location of people and some of their behaviours and habits being prompted or guided by technology. Some parts of the community might be very comfortable with that, others less so. But given the circumstance we're in, there'll probably be a greater willingness to consider these things and to take them on board, particularly if they prove to be effective.
Thanks very much. Peter, when we were talking about this before the call to prepare for it, you had some really interesting examples from other parts of the world where smart solutions and technology had been used to keep buildings healthy and safe places to work.
Yeah, I guess Neil's touched on some of those already. I think I'm a little bit in the position of, beware strangers bearing gifts at the moment. There's a lot of opportunity with technology, but it needs to be based on sound evidence. And for instance, thermal imaging, as we mentioned, and we're shown the examples, particularly from the Far East, of thermal imaging of people, say with a handheld thermometer or a screen in an office. What they don't tell you about is a large number of false positives that come from that, because somebody's just run up the steps from the mass transit railway or something. I think that will improve as artificial intelligence is engaged with some of these technologies as well. But it's still pretty much at its embryonic stage at the moment. So I'm not one for saying this is going to be the magic bullet. This is something that we can roll out based on evidence, so we need to be really careful about engaging with and make sure that we get proper results. The other thing I think in connection with the sorts of technology that you use, particularly around tracking, is we're a very, very different type of society to the one you see in I don't know, Singapore or Japan or China, where people are much more aware of their place in a bigger society rather than the strength of their being as an individual. So they'll accept social tracking, for instance, and you'll have seen some of this on the television recently about people tracked by apps into a coffee shop, tracked by camera, and everybody else who was in the coffee shop is identified and contacted afterwards. And I think they're quite happy to do that because of the sort of society that they have. But I can see with that being met with some hostility in the UK, where the idea of Big Brother keeping an eye on you and knowing where you are and what you are and who you've met. I think even though I can see the benefits of it, I think it's for the greater good. I still can't help but have the hairs on the back of my neck go up from an individual standpoint. So I think there's lots of ideas there and lots of prospects, but we need to be careful how we proceed with them. And I suspect, that if we were having this conversation a year or 18 months down the road, we'll have seen that some of those things will have risen to the ascendant, but many of them will not have gone far.
Well, as well as the societal pressures and constraints on rolling out technology, there's the law to back that up. Helen, can you add a few words on that and technology at this stage?
Yes, there certainly is, and I think it's an interesting one there. Peter mentions the difference in terms of the approach perhaps traditionally in the UK as regards technology and usage and intrusion into life and monitoring of life compared with other jurisdictions. Certainly here we are subject to that wonderful piece of legislation which we're implementing, which is the GDPR. and that requires any personal data, so any storage of data that is likely to be sensitive or personal, it potentially, if it isn't dealt with correctly, can open us to fines and swinging fines. And so that's something to be mindful of, not just in terms of collecting data using the FM facilities of a building, but be it a thermal imaging camera or some other tracking device, but also, and particularly if it picks up data about the vulnerable and that they're susceptible, for instance, to a medical condition. And I think that's one of the challenges of post-COVID, is that we do know that there are features coming out where people are more susceptible and more vulnerable, and these tend to be associated with underlying medical conditions and so forth. People may not have been willing to disclose those previously, they may be more so now, but there still is a wider horizon there. And I think, as you say, if this what people might accept today, they may not accept tomorrow. And then, of course, there's the realms of employment legislation, which I've mentioned, and I think Peter touched on lightly, but you wouldn't want to be in a position where there was in some way a discrimination use of data that could perhaps be suggested because of certain cultures, sectors, and so on, demographics even, and those things have to be watched. However, one thing I would say is that there is also a demographic sort of acceptance of the use of data and the intrusion of data, whereas the older generation traditionally were more wary of it. Certainly the younger generation have much more comfort with apps and mobile and smart tech, and so it'd be interesting to see how that plays out in terms of workforce and what people will be prepared to accept. But certainly legislation is there, and we will need to be very mindful of it in terms of our building systems and tracking and data storage.
An interesting glimpse into the future, actually, as those younger than us start to take control. So to bring the discussion to a close, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to predict just one change we'll see, which will actually last for a long time. So briefly, if you can, please, one long-lasting change, what will it be? And I'm going to start with Peter.
I think that now that home working has been shown to work at a very large scale, we can see that as a large part of any working environment in the future. And if people have found it to work, it's successful, and they get to ditch the commute in the process, why wouldn't they? I'll certainly do more of it.
Thanks very much. Helen, are you committed to home working, and what else do you see?
I do think Peter's right, but I think there's been indications quite clearly that there's been a rethink on social values. I think environmental and hygiene factors will be here and stay high on the agenda. The appreciation for green space, clean air, that will influence building design for the future and its location. And so I'd like to predict that we may see a resurgence in out-of-town office space and much greater calls for greener city space, with perhaps a focus on private realm and terraces, and that will impact on asset desirability, ability to lease and finance in the future.
That sounds great, actually. Neil, what's your prediction?
I think people will not take things for granted, perhaps, in what they've done in their general life. I think people will do things today that they might have put off before. So I think there will be some significant social implication, behavioural change for people. Once they've been set free from their homes, they want to go out there and do something. So I think, and people will remember this for a long time, so it will impact on the way that perhaps we weigh up investments in the things that we put into our workspace and our buildings. And there will be a more sort of wide-ranging and balanced discussion about the importance of health and well-being in whatever built environment that we create, and that will be long-lasting, I think, for at least a generation or two that work through in the built environment industry. So I think this will bring that to the fore. One thing I have hope for is that spirit of community, the collaboration and recognition, the important role played by key workers and their importance to society, and taking those balanced views into whatever we do and however we develop our particular areas of work going forward and the workspaces that we as an industry create to enable that to happen, and from wherever you work from.
I agree. I think one of the best things that we've seen recently has been the growth of community, whether it's local WhatsApp groups and also getting to know your own your co-workers in your own home. People now feel they know their colleagues better than ever they did before. That brings this seminar to a close. Thank you very much for joining us. The BCO Technical Committee is here to be guardians of best practice for your offices. If you've got any feedback on the guide, please do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much.